On October 4th, 2004, Spaceship One, an air-launched rocket-powered aircraft, became the first privately funded spaceship to carry the equivalent of 3 people into space twice over a 2-week period. And while that was a milestone in the development of space technology, it was really proof of concept for something called the X Prize, which uses public competitions to try to drive radical changes in technology to serve humanity. Scaled Composites, the company that built Spaceship One, received a $10 million prize, which helped to defer the $25 million cost of developing the technology. But the Ansari X Prize for suborbital flight was not by any means the first use of public competitions to try to drive technology. The practice at least goes back to the 18th century and has been responsible for the development of some important technologies. And it really reached its height at the turn of the 20th century, when a series of aviation challenges offered by the British newspaper The Daily Mail spurred extraordinary advances in airplane technology, transforming what was at the time maybe a peculiar hobby of the rich into one of the world's most important technologies. It is history that deserves to be remembered. On December 17, 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright made 4 flights in their hand-built Wright Flyer, built of a spruce frame covered with muslin and powered by a custom-built aluminum block 4-cylinder engine driving 2 8-foot-long propellers. While the longest flight that day only lasted 59 seconds, those flights are considered by many to be the first powered, controlled flight of a heavier-than-air airplane in history. But the Wright brothers were not by any means the only inventors pursuing flight at the time. French inventor Clement Ader had done trials with his steam-powered, bat-shaped Aviation 3 in 1897, although the attempts to fly were described as unsuccessful. German-American Gustav Whitehead reportedly flew his bamboo-framed, silk-covered bat-winged number 21 in 1901, more than 2 years ahead of the Wright brothers, a claim that is hampered by a lack of extant photographs of the craft in flight and modern determinations that the design was aerodynamically unsound. New Zealander Richard Pearse reportedly piloted his bamboo-framed monoplane mounted on a tricycle in March of 1903, 9 months ahead of the Wright brothers, although there is little record from the time to prove the claim. American Samuel Langley had received a grant of $50,000 from the U.S. War Department to develop his Aerodome, which had been successfully tested as a pilotless model. The Langley Aerodome was to be fired from a catapult on a boat and land in the Potomac River, but the 2 test flights in the fall of 1903 failed, with the airplane breaking apart as it left the catapult. While it was not successfully flown, the U.S. Smithsonian Institution, on whose board Langley served, maintained for years that it was the first powered design capable of flight. Russian-born German inventor William Kress had invented an innovative floatplane design called the Drachenflieger in 1900 that taxied well but did not have enough power to achieve flight. With all the competing claims, the Wright brothers' design, as well as their patent for what they called wing warping, which allowed controlled flight, was in dispute for many years and wasn't settled until 1914, 2 years after Wilbur Wright's death. But notably missing on the list of those competing for the claim of building the first airplane was anyone from Great Britain, which was an issue that worried a man named Alfred Charles William Harmsworth, who was the influential owner of the newspapers The Daily Mail and The Daily Mirror. A pioneer of popular journalism, at the end of the 19th century, his tabloid newspaper, The Daily Mail, which aimed at a working-class audience, held the world record for daily circulation. Determined to make England a center for aircraft development, Harmsworth had the Daily Mail offer a series of challenges which provided substantial monetary rewards to the first aviator who could complete stipulated tasks. In 1906, the first of the challenges offered 10,000 British pounds sterling to the first aviator who could fly the approximately 185 miles between the cities of London and Manchester in a 24-hour period with no more than 2 stops. While £10,000 was a very large incentive, the challenge was almost absurd at the time, when the flight time records for European airplanes were measured in seconds, not minutes. It would take some time to meet that challenge. More development was needed. In 1908, Anglo-French flyer Henry Farman won another Daily Mail challenge, offering £100 to the first aviator to fly an airplane a quarter-mile out and back in his French-made Voisin 1907 biplane, although the Wright brothers were recording much longer flights at the time. But in 1908, the Daily Mail made a more spectacular challenge, offering a prize of £500 for a flight made across the English Channel before the end of the year. It is suspected that Harmsworth, who had befriended Wilbur Wright and had developed much appreciation for the Wright brothers' designs, assumed that they would take the challenge. That was not at all unbelievable, as they had been making flights of nearly that distance since 1905. But Wilbur had only brought one of their airplanes with him to Europe in 1907, and the brothers were busy trying to sell government contracts for their design. In the end, the Wrights were unwilling to risk their only plane on a risky flight over water. But absent the Wright brothers, the challenge seemed impossible. The French newspaper Le Matin declared the challenge unwinnable, and in fact, there were no takers in 1908. The newspaper decided to extend the challenge through 1909 and double the prize to £1,000. The first to make the attempt was Frenchman Hubert Latham, an adventurer who had already crossed the channel in a balloon. Latham had been inspired by Wilbur Wright's performances in Paris in 1908. He made his first attempt at the channel crossing in a French-made Antoinette 7 monoplane on July 19, 1909, with reportedly more than 10,000 spectators watching him take off. But the engine failed just 8 miles in, and instead of being the first to cross the channel in an airplane, he became the first pilot to successfully ditch. That is, crash land in the water with a plane not designed for water landing. Only mildly injured, he had a second aircraft brought in and planned a second attempt. But before he could do that, another Frenchman, Louis Blériot, made another attempt. An engineer who had developed the world's first practical headlamp for automobiles, Blériot was making the attempt in an airplane of his own design, a monoplane called the Blériot 11. Blériot took off for his attempt at sunrise on July 25th. Latham was, reportedly, intending to make a second attempt the same day, and hearing that Blériot had taken off, tried to see if he could take off and overtake Blériot. But the wind was not cooperative, and Latham was not able to make his attempt. Despite poor visibility and a rough landing near Dover Castle, Blériot successfully crossed the channel in 36 minutes and 30 seconds. The following year, Englishman Claude Graham White, who had been inspired to become a pilot by Blériot's channel crossing, and Frenchman Louis Poulin, who had squabbled with the Wright brothers over patent rights in America before returning to Europe, competed to win the original Daily Mail contest announced in 1906 to fly from London to Manchester in 24 hours. Poulin was the first to complete the task in April of 1910. He made the trek in 12 hours, including an overnight stop in Lichfield, less than 5 years after the presumably impossible challenge was offered. More challenges followed, including a £10,000 prize for the first non-stop transatlantic flight, won by British aviators John Alcock and Arthur Brown in June of 1919, and the first solo flight by a woman from England to Australia, won by English aviator Amy Johnson in 1930. Alfred Harmsworth had an enormous impact on the newspaper industry, and through his newspapers, which had a circulation over 1 million, on world events. His vision for the Daily News Aviation Prizes not only spurred great feats of aviation, but helped to make Britain a central part of aviation development. Excitement over the challenges also sold a lot of newspapers. He passed away in 1922 at the age of 57. Some argue that what has been called the Wright brothers' patent war stalled airplane design in the United States, as all sides were less willing to engage in development with the patents in dispute, although some researchers deny that claim. In any case, by the First World War, the U.S. had fallen behind Europe in aircraft design, and American flyers flew in European airplanes. Wilbur Wright died in 1912 at the age of 45. His family always argued that exhaustion over fighting the patent dispute contributed to his early death. Orville Wright outlived his brother by more than 35 years, dying at the age of 76 in 1948, long enough to witness the dawn of supersonic flight. To be fair, there were numerous other challenges, prizes, and competitions for aviation during the era of the Daily Mail challenges. And airplane technology probably would have continued to develop anyway, as many of these flyers went on to find success manufacturing aircraft. But the Daily Mail challenges really represent some of the most important milestones in the development of aviation technology, and the challengers and the winners represent a virtual who's who of early aviation pioneers. The Daily Mail challenges represent a period where airplane technology went from short hops that only lasted a few seconds to the development of a reliable technology that would eventually carry billions of people. It is history that deserves to be remembered. It took a special kind of courage to be an early aviation pioneer. I mean, certainly it was dangerous to try to fly up in the air in a contraption that you probably built in your garage, but also it wasn't exactly an accepted avocation. Many people thought that the idea was downright crazy. Some even thought it heretical, believing that God never intended for man to fly. And so you didn't just risk life and limb with your machine, you also risked being ostracized and derided by your neighbors. Richard William Pearse of New Zealand was one of those early aviation pioneers whose neighbors viewed him with derision. They dismissively called him Bamboo Dick, referring to the bamboo that he used as the frame for his contraptions, or sometimes just Mad Pearse. And he died alone in a sanitarium in obscurity, but he may well have been the first man to fly an airplane driven by an engine. And controversial claims to historical first aside, he certainly represented a genius and a spirit that deserves to be remembered. He was born in December 1877 in Temeka, New Zealand. Diggory Pearse, his father, was a Cornish immigrant who worked as a cattle farmer. Richard was the fourth of 9 children in the family. They lived in a remote corner of the world and had to entertain themselves. Historians say the family created its own orchestra, with Richard playing the cello. They also created a tennis court to challenge each other to games. As a child, Pearse was described as a dreamer who showed promise as an inventor. Pearse's earliest inventions were geared towards improving the family's farm equipment, using a forge that he had created himself, built out of scrap metal. He might have made an excellent engineer, but his family didn't have the means to send him to a university, so his raw talent remained unrefined. Curiously similar to the Wright brothers, he tinkered with bicycles before turning his attention to flying machines. He invented a bicycle of his own design that used a bamboo frame that had vertical crank gears and self-inflating tires. In a later interview, Pearse says he shifted his attention to flying after a worldwide aviation challenge was issued. He said, "I did not attempt anything practical with the idea until in 1904, the St. Louis Exposition authorities offered a prize of $20,000 to the man who invented and flew a flying machine over a specific course. I did not, as you know, succeed in winning the prize. Neither did anybody." But eyewitnesses to Pearse's flying experiments say he was attempting flight earlier than 1904. In March 1902 or 1903, multiple witnesses saw Pearse crash into a 12-foot-high hedge on his property, but they couldn't agree on the year. Someone claimed he had taken a photo of Pearse's wreck in the hedge, but the photo's been lost. Unfortunately, the hospital where Pearse was treated for his flight injuries burned, and there are no records to corroborate the date. Historian and biographer George Ogilvy believes the flight took place in March 1903. To make his flight into the hedge possible, Pearse had created an engine from farm equipment for his flying machine sometimes prior to that. Remains of one of Pearse's engines, which was rediscovered in a garbage dump in 1963, shows that he made his 2 horizontally opposed cylinders from cast iron drain pipes. Pearse later claimed his engine was the most efficient lightweight engine that had been invented at the time, as it was capable of producing 1 horsepower for every 5 pounds of engine. Estimates based on the design suggest it was capable of about 15 horsepower, roughly comparable or even a little bit better than the engine used in the 1903 Wright Flyer. His aviation innovations were all the more impressive because of the fact that he was inventing in a near vacuum. He was so far removed from civilization that he couldn't follow the latest trends in aviation technology. He couldn't leverage the ideas of industrial centers that were manufacturing motor cars. And unlike the Wright brothers, he didn't even have a partner off whom he could bounce ideas. In fact, he largely invented in private due to the attitudes of his neighbors hiding in his garage. Many of them thought that he was being a heretic. If God had intended for men to fly, they argued, then we would have been born with wings. They mocked Pearse's distinctive bushy hair, laughed at his airplanes made out of bamboo, canvas, and wire. In an area where farming was key and airplanes were just fantasy, the inventor's farm often suffered from his distractions. But the man they called Bamboo Dick didn't let his neighbors' attitudes deter him. He worked out of sight of their prying eyes in his barn until he was ready to test his machines. Pearse mounted his bamboo frame on tricycle wheels and sat in the center of it with the engine above his head. Created simple, small ailerons for the wings. He is said to have been the first inventor to do so. The tricycle wheels, which included a steerable nose wheel, acted as a sort of landing gear, another first as the Wright's early planes used skids. Remarkably, the propeller had variable pitch blades, was tied directly to the crankshaft rather than requiring belts and a transmission as the Wright's plane did. Overall, Pearse's plane was said to resemble a modern monoplane rather than a biplane. Instead of the Wright brothers' method of wing warping, Pearse developed a system of flaps and ailerons that did not require twisting the wing, the system used by virtually all aircraft today. The placement of his controls for pitch and yaw, however, made them likely insufficient for controlled flight. Sadly, there are no newspaper reports of Pearse's exploits. Even he seemed unconcerned with the little attention he received. He wrote to a newspaper in 1915, "The honor of inventing the aeroplane is the product of many minds. Preeminence will undoubtedly be given to the Wright brothers, as they were actually the first to make successful flights with a motor-driven airplane." Pearse was dismissive of his early efforts and said his first flights were too bumpy and out of control to really count. He moved to the town of Milton in 1911 and may have dumped many of his experiments at the time because the ground near his new home was too hilly for his flying machines. He moved again to Christchurch and continued with his inventions, both flight-related and otherwise. While he continued tinkering and eventually innovated new fixes for his plane, by then aviation was developing rapidly internationally, and he saw little point in continuing. In addition to inventing a potato planting machine and a device that could record sound, towards the end of his life, Pearse seemed to have been working on a flying car. Roughly described as a cross between a windmill and a rubbish cart, Pearse's tilt-rotor machine had a tail and wings that could fold up into a storage compartment. The idea of creating a vehicle that could as easily drive down the road or take off into the air, an idea that is yet to be perfected today. His hope was to create a machine that would make flying as available to the common person as Henry Ford's Model T had made automobiles. Towards the end of his life, Pearse suffered from paranoia and delusions that someone like a spy from a foreign country was going to come and steal his inventions. He spent the last year of his life in Sunnyside Mental Hospital and died age 75 in July 1953. Pearse's work likely would have been forgotten, except that the trustee assigned to Pearse's estate was going through the papers Pearse left behind and recognized the brilliance of the late inventor's designs. He brought them to the attention of George Bolt, another of New Zealand's early aviators. Bolt went to the garbage dump and unearthed some of Pearse's machines, marveling at their design. The New Zealand Museum of Trade and Transport in Auckland has some of them on display today. Bolt also went back to the area where Pearse made his infamous flight into the hedge and interviewed the witnesses to that historic event. Much of Pearse's legacy seems to be tied up in the question of whether he achieved powered flight ahead of the Wright brothers, a question that seems important to some New Zealanders but didn't seem particularly important to Richard Pearse, who argued that his first rough attempts at aviation were simply too rough to qualify, even though he held himself to a particularly high standard. But the question itself is largely academic. He was unknown by his contemporaries. His designs, though advanced, were not seen and so didn't impact the development of aviation. He did secure patents, but they were largely unrecognized and unenforced. But that doesn't mean his innovations were any less impressive. He was a man who had a vision of flying through the air years ahead of his time. Of course, we do that all the time today. It really raises the question of how important his genius might have been if he had simply been inventing somewhere else, or if he'd had the means to secure an education, or if he'd had corporate backers, like many of his contemporaries did. But if it weren't for men of vision like Richard Pearse, who was willing to continue tinkering in his garage despite his neighbor's derision, we might still be tied to the ground because we lack that bit of inspiration, that vision that allowed us to challenge the hedges that surround our life. The decade following the end of the First World War represented a period of significant change in the Western world. An era of sustained prosperity. It represented not just a social and artistic dynamism, but a huge development of new technologies. Women got the boat, houses got electricity, automobiles replaced horses, and jazz music blossomed. Social critics lamented the new materialism of the age. And one company managed to combine two of the new technologies of the era and become a world leader in both. You might never have heard of the Alexander Corporation, but at one time they were at the top of two of the industries that defined the Roaring Twenties. And that is history that deserves to be remembered. Airplanes had come of age in the Great War, able to carry more weight, greater distances, more reliably. But the war had not just helped to develop the technology, it had made lots of planes. Prior to the war, few people had even seen a plane. After, people could actually buy them. In 1920, the English Air Force auctioned off 10,000 planes and 30,000 aircraft engines. In the United States, the Army sold off thousands of the Curtiss JN-4, the legendary Jenny. Surplus aircraft were sometimes sold in their original packing crates for as little as $50. And the war had produced the pilots who could fly them. These pilots popularized the new machines with feats of daring in the era of the barnstormer. Pilots competed in races and contests, charged $1 per minute for rides, and tried to outdo each other performing stunts. Many famous pilots earned their wings in the era, notably Charles Lindbergh, who barnstormed under the name Daredevil Lindbergh. Pioneering daredevil Bessie Coleman became the first woman of African American descent to hold a pilot's license. Unable to find anyone willing to train her in the U.S., she traveled to France to get her training and earned an international pilot license in 1921. Barnstorming under the name Queen Bess, she became a role model for millions. And the beginning of regular air routes with airmail delivery also offered opportunities. By 1925, U.S. Post Office airplanes were delivering 14 million letters and packages a year and were maintaining regular flight schedules. Airmail appealed particularly to bankers and other businessmen who regularly began to use it to move checks and financial documents more quickly, reducing the float on checks and the length of time that funds were idle and unavailable for use. In 1925, the U.S. government started contracting airmail routes, helping to spur a profitable civil aeronautics industry. In the same era, cinema would take over entertainment in the Western world. At the beginning of the 1920s, cinema was brief, colorless, and quiet. But that would all soon change. Techniques for adding color to film were patented as early as 1899, but the process made a massive change with the advent of Technicolor. Technicolor not only produced a greater color vibrancy than earlier colorization methods like Cinemacolor, it also did not require special projectors. In 1922, the film The Toll of the Sea became the first general release film in Technicolor. Technicolor sequences were then featured in some of the biggest blockbusters of the 1920s. In 1919, genius inventor Lee DeForest, whose invention of the Audion tube allowed the electronics revolution, patented a process called phonofilm, which recorded synchronized sound directly onto film. In a confluence of new technologies, one of DeForest's first test films for the system was of a flying Curtiss Jenny. In 1926, Don Juan was the first film released with sound effects and music, and 1927's The Jazz Singer became the first talkie. By the mid-1920s, 50 million Americans a week, the equivalent of half the population, went to the movies. By the end of the 1920s, 83 cents out of every American dollar spent on entertainment went to the movie industry. But as cinema and aircraft rose to new heights, one company managed to rise to leadership in both industries. J. Don and Don M. Alexander were born in Keokuk, Iowa, and got their career started early as children in outdoor advertising. They used a French stereoscopic projector to project colorful slides and advertisements for local businesses on bed sheets that were fashioned as movie screens. They turned that into a real business in 1919 when they purchased a movie studio in Spokane, Washington, and started to produce film advertising. In film advertising, you would film a commercial for a local business, and then you go pay a movie theater to show that commercial before or in between features. Don M. was technically minded, so he would handle the production, but J. Don was a salesman, and he would lead the sales force. It was a new industry. It took some time to develop. According to the company website, they made $2.50 in their first year. But the idea eventually caught on, and they became very successful. By 1923, they had outgrown the Spokane facility, and they purchased a new, much larger facility covering more than 2 city blocks in Englewood, Colorado, near Denver. This new facility allowed them to sell a whole lot more advertising, and J. Don had developed a very successful strategy for recruiting salespeople by using a liberal commission policy and a good training program to help them be successful. But he had bigger plans. J. Don thought that his salespeople spent too much time in travel, and what he wanted to do was to send his sales force across the nation in airplanes. In 1923, that idea was downright revolutionary. He sent one of his salesmen to Missouri, then a center for airplane manufacturing, to acquire a plane and learn how to fly. He purchased a 1920 Laird Swallow, a rugged biplane that had room for an instructor and a student in tandem open cockpits, for $2,300. The salesman took 10 hours of instruction and then flew for Colorado. By the time he got there, he was a veteran, and he taught many of the other members of the sales force to fly. Sold on the idea of an airborne sales force, which would not only spend less time traveling, but also be able to deliver films faster and attract attention as a bonus, J. Don decided to purchase 50 airplanes. But at the time, airplane manufacturers were hardly producing a plane a month, and no one took his request for 50 seriously. So J. Don asked his company engineers to develop their own design for a small, lightweight airplane that could be operated with a minimum of expense. First flown in September 1925, that design was called the Eagle Rock. It was a simple, rugged biplane that was easy and inexpensive to operate. It was 25 feet 11 inches long, had a wingspan of 36 feet 8 inches, and could accommodate a pilot and passenger, and could be fitted with a number of different available airplane engines. Foreseeing a market for the plane for small businesses and individual owners, the brothers incorporated the Alexander Aircraft Company, and then formed Alexander Industries, which held both the film company and the aircraft manufacturer. The plan was to build the airplanes on the Alexander facility there in Englewood, Colorado, but a fire there and a lack of ability to expand compelled them to move their operations south of Denver to Colorado Springs. The Eagle Rock became one of the most popular planes of its era and was used for airmail and crop dusting. But because it was able to fit a number of different engines, it was especially popular for barnstorming and air racing. In a time when airplane manufacturers regularly collapsed after making just a few planes, the Alexander factory in Colorado Springs was able to manufacture 8 airplanes a day, and the company had 33 distributors and 143 dealers throughout the nation. Nearly 900 Alexander Eagle Rocks were eventually produced. For a brief period between 1928 and 1929, Alexander Aircraft was the largest manufacturer of aircraft in the world. The most spectacular event in aviation history of the era was Charles Lindbergh's 1927 solo transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. Reportedly, the Eagle Rock had been one of the planes considered for his flight, but the factory production orders were already full. Eventually, he chose his famous Ryan monoplane for his legendary flight. For a brief period of time, one of the world's largest airplane manufacturers and one of the world's largest film studios were part of the same company. J. Don and Don M. Alexander had ridden to the top of the Roaring Twenties. But everything changed for them and for the world with the stock market crash of 1929. With the Great Depression came the collapse of the market for small aircraft. As orders dried up, the Alexander Aircraft Company filed for bankruptcy in 1932. The film advertising company remained successful into the 1950s. By the early 1950s, the Alexander Film Company was producing between 2,000 and 3,000 films annually and maintained a library of films covering 8,200 different subjects. But the advent of television and decline of local theaters put an end to the market for film advertising. They found some success in television advertising, but steadily declined. The company stopped producing films in 1967. J. Don Alexander passed away in 1955 at the age of 70, and Don M. Alexander passed away in 1972 at the age of 79. Their leadership in both the film and airplane industries perfectly represents, encapsulates the unique dynamism and optimism of that era we called the Roaring Twenties. It is history that deserves to be remembered. It is February 17th, and 110 years ago today, Glenn Hammond Curtis, a man who was described by the press as the fastest man alive, was having lunch with officers of the protected cruiser USS Pennsylvania. It's a more auspicious event than it sounds. In fact, some call it the birth of naval aviation. Curtis's accomplishment that day in San Diego Harbor was the culmination of a series of aviation firsts by Curtis and another pilot that was working with him that had begun the previous November. It is history that deserves to be remembered. There is, of course, some contest to the claim that February 17th, 1911 was the birth of naval aviation. Lighter-than-air balloons were being used for military observation in the French Revolutionary Wars at the end of the 18th century. The first use of air power by the Navy dates at least to 1849 in the Austro-Hungarian paddle-wheel steamer SMS Volcano. In 1848, the city of Venice had rebelled against the empire and declared itself the independent Republic of San Marco. The rebellion was an early part of the Italian Unification Wars and resulted in the siege and bombardment of the city by Austrian forces. In a military first, the Austro-Hungarian forces attempted to bombard the city with 200 unmanned paper hot air balloons carrying 30-pound bombs that would be dropped using a timed fuse. While most of the balloons were launched from land, the Volcano, a steamer with a displacement of 532 short tons, was equipped as a balloon carrier, and several of the balloons were launched from the ship. While it was a novel and apparently first aggressive use of balloons in warfare, it wasn't highly successful. Because of unpredictable air currents, virtually all the balloons missed their target, but it did represent the offensive use of air power from a naval vessel. But the primary use of early lighter-than-air aviation in a military role was for observation, and several vessels were outfitted as balloon carriers during the U.S. Civil War. Among those, the barge USS George Washington Parke Custis might be considered by some to be the first true aircraft carrier, in that the barge was modified to carry a gas-generating apparatus, and thus was built to tend and maintain balloons, rather than simply serving as a launching point. Later, the Confederate Navy outfitted a steam tug, CSS Teaser, as a balloon tender. While the principle of using aircraft to extend a Navy's observation power was established, in practice hot air balloons had limited use and took too much space to operate from a naval combat ship. In 1901, a colorful American aviationist named Samuel Franklin Cody offered the Royal Navy an alternative: a kite. Cody developed the idea of kites that could fly very high and were large enough to carry a human observer, and in 1908 demonstrated the use of such an observation kite from the battleship HMS Revenge. Cody would go on to develop British Army Airplane No. 1, the first airplane built in Britain. But balloons and kites had inherent limitations. They couldn't really be steered. They were in essence tethered to the ships. In 1908, the United Kingdom formed an aerial subcommittee of the Committee for Imperial Defense, and they determined that the most promising technology for naval air reconnaissance were rigid airships, with which the Germans had found some success. As a result, in 1909, a contract was awarded to the armament firm Vickers, Sons and Maxim to produce Britain's first rigid airship, Her Majesty's Airship No. 1, also known as the Mayfly. While the airship would largely have been operated from land, the protected cruiser HMS Hermione was modified to operate as a tender, allowing the ship to be docked and launched at sea. While airships would later be successfully operated from tenders, the Mayfly was destroyed in an accident while being removed from her hangar in September 1911, before the ship's first flight. While various kinds of kites and airships would continue to find use for navies through the Second World War, it was clear even when Mayfly was ordered that if naval aviation was to be more than a novelty, it would require the operation of fixed-wing aircraft. The Royal Navy established a flying school in June of 1910. In the same year, the French Navy purchased a Farman III and qualified a pilot. But despite all the development to that point, the core concept of naval aviation, the practical use of aircraft operating from naval ships, was still unproven. This is where Glenn Hammond Curtis comes in. Born in Hammondsport, New York in 1878, Curtis began working with combustion engines at the turn of the century. A bicycle messenger for Western Union, he tinkered with adding a single-cylinder engine of his own design to a bicycle. His early design reportedly used a carburetor adopted from a soup can. In 1903, he rode one of his motorcycles to set a new motorcycle land speed record of 64 miles per hour. By 1907, he designed a motorcycle using a V8 engine, setting a new record of 136.36 miles per hour. Newspapers dubbed him the fastest man alive. It was his expertise with engines that took him into the field of aviation. His engines powered the California Aero, the first successful rigid airship in America, setting a number of records in 1907. He was invited by Alexander Graham Bell to join his Aerial Experiment Association, which worked together to design an experimental aircraft called the June Bug, piloted by Curtis, that won the first aeronautical prize offered in the United States, the Scientific American Prize. He was among the first batch of Americans to receive a pilot's license from the Aero Club of America, receiving license number 1. As the licenses of the first batch were assigned alphabetically, Wilbur Wright received license number 5. Curtis trained a number of pilots, including Blanche Scott, considered by some to be America's first woman pilot. Another was Eugene Ely, a race car driver and auto salesman who had taught himself to fly a 4-cylinder Curtiss plane before working with Curtiss directly. Curtiss participated in a number of aeronautical prize competitions across the United States and Europe and helped to demonstrate the feasibility of military aircraft, demonstrating simulated aerial bombing and shooting at ground targets from an airplane to U.S. naval officers in the summer of 1910. But the demonstrations that would prove pivotal began in November. The Secretary of the Navy had assigned Captain Washington Irving Chambers to develop aviation on behalf of the Navy, and working with Chambers on November 14, 1910, Ely flew a Curtiss Model D from the deck of a naval vessel. The Curtiss Model D used a 4-cylinder, 40-horsepower Curtiss engine in a pusher design, as the propeller was behind the pilot and the engine pushed the airplane. The structure was made of spruce and bamboo and used ailerons rather than wing warping for pitch control in order to avoid Wright brothers' patents. It was a small, sturdy plane for its era with a wingspan of 38 feet and capable of reaching 50 miles per hour. The ship was the scout cruiser USS Birmingham, fitted with an 83-foot wooden ramp on the forecastle. The plane was hoisted on board separately from its engine, which was then installed. The original plan was to take off with the ship moving into the wind at 10 knots inside Chesapeake Bay, but the weather was uncooperative, and Ely decided to take off with the ship standing still in order to avoid an incoming squall. It was almost a disaster. After the plane left the deck, it plummeted towards the sea, and Ely, who couldn't swim, was barely able to level the plane before it crashed into the ocean. The tricycle landing gear actually dipped in the water, as did the spinning propeller, which was damaged. Ely got the plane back to land at the Naval Air Station, but due to poor visibility and the damaged propeller, was forced to make an emergency landing before reaching the landing field. Still, he was the first person to successfully take off from a ship using a fixed-wing aircraft. The following January, Ely managed the reverse feat. Taking off from San Bruno, California, Ely landed a Curtiss Model D aboard the battleship USS Pennsylvania, which had a 130 by 32-foot platform built onto its stern. To slow the plane had a hook attached to its undercarriage, which caught ropes attached to sandbags, similar to the arrestor cables still used to land on aircraft carriers today. Eli's two flights, taking off and landing from naval vessels, were aviation firsts, and they were precursors to the way that naval aviation occurred through the Second World War and into today, but the Navy was still unconvinced. In reality, trying to regularly take off and land on a moving naval vessel was simply not practical with the machines that they had at the time. But Glenn Curtiss himself would offer an alternative the following February. Curtiss had modified one of his Model Ds with a pontoon float, and successfully taken off with his hydro airplane from water on January 26th. While he was not the first person to successfully operate a float plane, Frenchman Henri Fabre had successfully flown the Fabre Hydravion in March 1910. Curtiss was the first to do so in the United States. Curtiss's plane was much sturdier than Fabre's, and eventually Curtiss would set many records in his float planes. And in his float plane, Curtiss had what the U.S. Navy could see as a more reliable method of using a naval aircraft. On February 17, 1911, Curtiss took off in his float plane and landed next to the Pennsylvania. The plane was lifted aboard by a hoist, and Curtiss had his lunch with the ship's officers. After, the plane was lowered back into the ocean with the hoist, and Curtiss took off. The Navy was convinced and made their first order, ordering 3 improved Curtiss Model E planes at $4,400 each. Eventually, the Navy would acquire 14 Curtiss Model Es, which would be responsible for numerous aviation records and firsts. Curtiss received the Aero Club of America Trophy for achievement in aeronautics in 1911 for his development of the float plane. His role in demonstrating the feasibility of operating fixed-wing aircraft from ships has led some to call him the father of naval aviation, and to list February 17th as the birth of naval aviation. Curtiss Model AB-2 float planes would be used in the U.S. occupation of Vera Cruz in 1914, marking the first ever operational use of naval aircraft, and the first time that U.S. aviators faced combat and ground fire. In 1915, the U.S. launched another AB-2 from a catapult aboard the protected cruiser USS North Carolina. Catapults would become the primary way that battleships and cruisers launched aircraft through the 1940s. Certainly there are those who would contest that Glenn Curtiss is the father of naval aviation, both because of the limited use of naval aviation that predates him and because there were others who were developing similar concepts at virtually the same time. In May of 1912, Royal Navy Commander Charles Rumney Sampson became the first man to take off from a moving naval vessel with a fixed-wing aircraft from HMS Hibernia. Still, the flights by Eli and Curtiss in 1910 and 1911 were pivotal moments in demonstrating the capability of fixed-wing aircraft to operate from and support naval vessels. Naval aviation would play a role in the Great War, where seaplanes were carried by ocean-going tenders and larger float planes were used for anti-submarine warfare. HMS Furious, the first naval ship designed with a flat deck to operate wheeled aircraft, was commissioned in 1917. Flat-top carriers would be produced by several nations between the wars, and the aircraft carrier would largely supplant the battleship as the means of naval supremacy during the Second World War and beyond. Glenn H. Curtiss Aviation Company would create the JN-4 Jenny during the war, which would not only become popular military training aircraft, but would be produced in such numbers that it played a central role in popularizing civil aviation in the United States. And a Curtiss NC Nancy flying boat would be the first plane to make a transatlantic flight in May 1919. Glenn Curtiss cashed out his stock and retired from his aviation manufacturing company in 1920. And in 1929, that company merged with the Wright Corporation to become Curtiss-Wright, which is still a major player in the aerospace industry with 2018 revenues of about $2.5 billion. Curtiss had many other inventions outside of aviation as well, among them the Curtiss Aerocar, the precursor to the modern fifth-wheel RV. Glenn Hammond Curtiss, the father of naval aviation, passed away due to complications from an appendicitis in 1930. On March 3rd, 1915, a 2-paragraph rider to the Naval Appropriations Act created a new federal agency with a staff of 12 and a budget of $5,000. And then a June 1917 edition of the New York Sun wrote, "So far as the average American was concerned, it was promptly forgotten." I would imagine not 1 in 1,000 Americans has ever heard of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, more or less is familiar with their body of work. But that is too bad. because they had an outsized effect on American history, played a critical role in the Allied victory in the Second World War, and shepherded America into the jet age. The history of the NACA deserves to be remembered. In less than a decade, the United States went from first in flight with the Wright brothers' flights in 1903 to lagging behind our European peers. The idea of a National Center for Aeronautical Research was proposed at least as early as 1911 by the American Aeronautical Society. In 1912, President Taft appointed a commission to study the creation of a National Aerodynamic Laboratory. The commission was headed by Robert Woodard, a well-regarded civil engineer, physicist, and mathematician, and president of the Carnegie Institute of Washington. But the effort failed to get an enabling act to create the laboratory through Congress. One argument to explain the lagging behind in the development of aircraft that has been frequently made is that it was the Wright brothers defending their 1906 patent that had the result of both distracting the industry and disincentivizing production. There were certainly patent disputes, but that is hardly the only reason. A rather more compelling explanation can be found in a congressional study whose results were reported in a hearing before the House Committee on Military Affairs in 1913. Between 1908 and 1913, Germany led the world in government expenditures on aviation at $28 million equivalent. In the same year, the U.S. had spent $435,000 for all federal support of flight-related activity, putting our spending 13th in the world, behind that of Chile and Greece. The U.S. is simply not yet sold on the concept in an era when aeronautical adventures made the news for accidents as much as for accomplishments. While the U.S. Secretary of War had requested a $500,000 appropriation for the Army Aeronautical Division in 1908, Congress had approved none. In fact, no money was appropriated between 1908 and 1911. What was there was funded by small surpluses from other War Department accounts. Well, $125,000 was appropriated for 1912 and another $100,000 for 1913. By 1913, the entire U.S. Army Aeronautical Division included just 10 aviators and 15 aircraft. And while the military was having difficulty convincing Congress of the problem, one person who did recognize it was Charles Doolittle Walcott, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. In 1913, Walcott funded a fact-finding tour overseas, sending a physicist and an aeronautical engineer. There, they established contacts with European counterparts, which would be important later. Came back in 1914 with a damning report on the disparity of investment in aeronautics between the United States and European nations. The outbreak of war in 1914 demonstrated the imperative, but offered a new challenge, as President Wilson and national sentiment was to stay out of the war, thus making any military expenditure suspect and perceived as a potential threat to U.S. neutrality. Walcott, with the credibility of the Smithsonian behind him, was able to convince congressional leaders to include funds for an aeronautical research organization in the 1915 Naval Appropriations Act. The legislation was just 2 short paragraphs. The budget was just $5,000. But the organization thus created, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, or NACA, would eventually play a vital role in U.S. aircraft development, particularly during the Second World War. In an odd twist, Walcott himself was neither a physicist nor an aeronautical engineer. The man who would play such a critical role in the creation of the organization that so advanced American aviation was a paleontologist. The purpose of the committee was, according to the legislation, to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight, with a view to their practical solutions. The committee represented a panel of 12 people, all unpaid. 2 would come from the War Department, 2 from the Navy Department, and 1 each from the Smithsonian, officially a trust instrumentality of the United States, the Weather Bureau, and the Bureau of Standards, plus 5 more members acquainted with aeronautics. The full committee would meet semi-annually, but an executive committee of 7 members would generally keep track of aeronautical problems for the committee to address. The first chairman of the committee was Brigadier General George P. Scriven, Chief Signal Officer of the Army. Walcott represented the Smithsonian Institute and was the chairman of the executive committee. The original 5 members acquainted with aeronautics were all university professors, among them a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins University named Joseph Sweetman Ames. While the enabling legislation was a political compromise slipped into a naval bill, the public expectations of the committee were high. A headline in the April 23, 1915 edition of the Washington, D.C. Evening Star reported on the first meeting of the committee. It read, "Problems in flying soon to be tackled." It seems a big order,
as the budget for the NACA for the first 5 years was just $5,000 annually.
Well, Walcott's original idea was to create a national laboratory to study aeronautical science. That would have to wait. The committee was not expected to do any actual research. They were expected to coordinate and prioritize research that would presumably be done at universities and military facilities.
But the scope of the problems in flying proved far greater than anticipated, especially as Europe had already moved into war. The New York Sun wrote in April 1917, provision for the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics was made in the Naval Appropriations Bill passed March 3, 1915. At the time, there was no adequate conception of the work which would ultimately have to be done by this committee, just as there was no adequate conception of the tremendous part which aeronautics was to play in the European war, less than a year old, and all subsequent warfare. As the U.S. entered the war that it had sought to avoid, the Sun notes how the role of the committee had grown. Now, however, it is launched on a campaign of work which is not only of vital importance for war, but which will be far-reaching in its influence long after the present struggle is over. The task before the small, virtually unfunded committee was enormous. Despite the huge manufacturing capacity of the nation at the outbreak of war, only one large factory, the Curtiss factory in Buffalo, New York, was producing aircraft. Most aircraft produced in the United States were built slowly, in small numbers, in small shops. The U.S. military had few aeronautics training schools, and even fewer trained pilots. And you might see the committee as having failed in the campaign that the Sun had touted. During the Great War, with the exception of some Curtiss-Wright seaplanes used for submarine patrol, U.S. flyers flew planes designed and built in Europe. And despite robust enlistment, only a handful of American-trained flyers arrived in Europe in time to join the fight. But the U.S. participation in the war was brief, less than 20 months from the declaration of war to the end of the war. The extent of the U.S. mobilization was actually impressive, astounding even. Our mobilization certainly occurred more quickly than the Central Powers had planned, but there are limits to how far you can develop military aviation, essentially from scratch, in 20 months. Still, the committee did important work, coordinated research on wireless communication for aircraft, coordinated tests of airplane propellers, tested and established standards for aircraft engines and parts. They advocated for the creation of more military training facilities and coordinated the return of American officers who were serving in foreign militaries to train new pilots. Although possibly the most significant contribution during the Great War was mediating patent disputes between the Glenn Curtiss and the Wright-Martin companies, negotiating a cross-licensing agreement that consolidated patents. The compromise not only sped aircraft production, but did so without the requirement that the government condemn any patents, which would have negatively impacted innovation.
They might not have been able to train a lot of pilots in time to fight in the war, but they did train a lot of pilots, and that would have a large impact on aviation in America after the war. The efforts of the committee meant not only that the United States was much better prepared for the next war, but also on a much more robust path for the development of civil aviation.
While the board was involved in a dizzying array of projects, they had not lost sight of the original goal of creating a national aeronautics research center, including an experimental field and laboratory, something the board called for in its first report in 1915. Congress finally agreed to the appropriation, and the NACA chose a site near Washington, D.C., in Elizabeth City County. Ground was broken on the new facility in 1917. At the urging of Walcott, the new facility was named after Samuel Pierpont Langley, an aviation pioneer who had preceded Walcott as director of the Smithsonian Institution. The then titled Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, now the Langley Research Center, was dedicated in June 1920 and had a staff of 11. The new laboratory included the first of what would become a hallmark of NACA research, a wind tunnel. The first was small and outdated, but by 1931 the facility was operating multiple tunnels, including the largest wind tunnel in the world, capable of testing full-sized aircraft and eventually spacecraft. Work largely done at Langley in the post-war era established the NACA as one of the premier aeronautical research organizations in the world, and the facility at Langley attracted engineers from all over the country. One of their most significant contributions of the interwar era was the NACA cowling. Radial engines were generally seen as the most efficient for propeller-driven aircraft, but they were air-cooled. Conventional wisdom was that they had to be left essentially open in order to get the airflow needed to cool them, but that created significant drag. The question brought to the NACA was, could a radial engine be made more aerodynamic while still getting sufficient airflow for cooling? Developed by NACA engineer Frank Weick, the cowling reduced the drag of air-cooled radial engines. The design redirects and accelerates differential airflow in much the same way that a wing produces lift, but directs the airflow so that it produces thrust, reducing drag by around 60%. By redirecting the air over the cylinder heads, the cowling actually improved engine cooling while increasing the top speed of aircraft tested by an astonishing 16%. In 1929, flyer Frank Hawks broke the Los Angeles to New York nonstop speed record with a time of 18 hours and 13 minutes in a Lockheed Air Express equipped with the NACA cowling. Officials at Lockheed insisted that the record would not have been possible without the cowling. The design was a breakthrough. The NACA estimated that the possible fuel savings alone from industry adoption of the cowling would have saved millions of dollars more than the entire appropriations that had ever been made for the NACA since its inception. The attention gained by the discovery was a victory for the NACA, and perhaps more importantly, Auburn University history professor James Hansen noted in a 1998 NASA publication From Engineering Science to Big Science for the methodology of engineering research. The NACA cowling changed aviation. After its invention, a version was used on virtually every radial engine aircraft, including those that powered the great bomber fleets of the Second World War. But it really changed the Edison version of invention as a matter of inspiration to one of rigorous testing and experiment. In brief, while the nature of the accomplishment might have been somewhat misunderstood and in some ways deliberately oversold, at the time it sold stakeholders, particularly Congress, on the NACA and its laboratory model. Meanwhile, the committee was instrumental in coordinating assistance among governmental agencies to ensure the success of airmail by the post office, coordinated with the Weather Bureau to establish stations for measuring atmospheric phenomenon, and developing plans to prepare for the military a reserve aerial program, which would make them better prepared in case of another war. Langley ran full-scale flight tests, and in doing so established guidelines and procedures for such tests and pioneered processes for training test pilots. Experiments using the NACA wind tunnels improved propeller design, aircraft aerodynamics, and improved the value of retractable landing gear. The NACA demonstrated that the placement for multi-engine aircraft was more efficient when incorporated into the wing structure, an important part of the design of the large multi-engine commercial aircraft of the interwar era, as well as the multi-engine bombers of the Second World War. They developed a numerical system that allowed a standardized understanding of airfoils and developed the laminar flow airfoil, which reduced drag. The system is still used in the design of airfoils, wings of modern aircraft. As the 1930s progressed, it became clear to NACA people watching Europe that European nations, particularly Germany and Italy, were making increased commitments to aeronautical research, and that much of that effort was focused on military aircraft development. It became obvious that the NACA would have to expand its facilities. The Navy advocated for a facility on the West Coast near the growing aircraft industry in California. A new laboratory was authorized at an airfield near Sunnyvale, California called Moffett Field. Originally built as a naval air station as the home of the base for the rigid airship USS Macon, but was then under the jurisdiction of the Army. They named the new facility after Joseph Ames, who had replaced Charles Walcott as director of the NACA in 1927. The Ames Research Center opened in 1939. An additional aircraft engine research facility was opened near Cleveland, a center of manufacturing. So how important was the NACA to the war? Well, for example, the laminar wing was a key design element that allowed for the notable agility of the North American P-51 Mustang, considered one of the best fighter aircraft of the war. According to history professor Roger E. Bilston, writing in the third edition of the NASA history series Orders of Magnitude, a history of the NACA and NASA, when the Boeing Model 299, the prototype for the B-17, performance exceeded expectations, Boeing sent a letter of appreciation to the NACA for its contributions to the plane's flaps, airfoil, and engine cowlings. The letter wrote, "It appears your organization can claim a considerable share in the success of this particular design." In particular, manufacturers faced difficulty with engine performance at high altitudes. The NACA developed standards and testing methods that allowed the development of superchargers. Nearly every U.S. military aviation power plant of the war utilized the results of this research in forced induction systems that gave U.S. planes a performance advantage over 15,000 feet that their Axis adversaries never matched. The NACA wind tunnels proved exceptionally useful for finding design elements that disrupted airflow, allowing manufacturers to clean up designs in ways that improved efficiency and performance. That service was performed on the prototypes of the Grumman F-4 Wildcat, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. When the Lockheed P-38 Lightning demonstrated problems with loss of control during high-speed dives, NACA wind tunnel experiments identified the reason and led to the development of dive flaps that were then incorporated into numerous aircraft designs, saving pilots' lives. This research would prove critical later in understanding forces at transonic speeds. Wind tunnel testing of larger planes was done with models. The NACA wind tunnels were used in the design of the Boeing B-29. NACA testing determined the most survivable ways for airplanes to ditch in the ocean, again saving lives and developing procedures still relevant today. A January 1944 editorial in the journal Aviation stated, "How much is it worth to this country to make sure that we don't find the Luftwaffe our superiors when we start the second front? We spend in one night over Berlin more than $20 million. The NACA requires now $17,546,700 for this year's work. These raids are prime factors in winning the war. How can we do more towards victory than by spending the price of one air raid in research that will keep our air forces in the position which the NACA has made possible?" How powerful was the effect of the NACA on the war? It would be impractical to try to list all the projects, not to mention the efforts to coordinate aeronautical research, design, and development in which the NACA was involved over the war years. But in a simple sense, NACA efforts gave the Allied advantages in military aeronautics that the Axis was never able to match. Certainly, some of the most significant military aircraft designs fielded by the United States during the war were significantly improved due to the efforts of the NACA. Even the Trinity Project owes its debt to the NACA, as the planes to which the NACA made such a significant contribution were the only means at the time to deliver the product of their work. The role played in the war was represented in the growth of the agency. In 1938, the Langley staff was 429. In 1945, it was more than 3,000. After the war, the NACA was the agency in charge of testing and development of the Bell X-1 and helped to develop the X-15. NACA research on the aerodynamic forces encountered during transonic flight and supersonic flight provided the fundamental design rules that were applied to the early U.S. military jet aircraft, such as the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger and the Grumman F-11 Tiger and the B-58 Hustler. These design rules, the Whitcomb Area Rule, named after NACA engineer Richard Whitcomb, and the Supersonic Area Rule, developed by NACA engineer Robert T. Jones, both of which regard drag and efficiency, are critical elements used in the design of virtually all high-performance aircraft today.
In 1958, after the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the United States decided that they needed to consolidate all their aeronautical research and rocketry programs into a single civilian agency. When NASA was created in 1958, they absorbed all the facilities and the 8,000 employees of the NACA. It is fair to say that the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics was the foundation upon which the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was founded. And NASA continues the mission of the NACA today, still a major contributor to the development of aeronautical science and aviation technology, because after all, the A in NASA stands for aeronautics.